This is on you. Willa, every IT failure we've had, own it. Evan didn't lower his voice. He didn't glance around the conference room to check faces. He wanted witnesses. 30 people sat frozen while he stood at the head of the table. Confident, impatient, already bored with the damage he was doing. The word failure hung in the air like something sticky and hard to scrub off. I didn't speak, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood the rule of moments like this. Explanations are useless when someone is performing authority. I'm Willa Hayes. I built the system this company runs on. I designed the architecture when there were 6 employees, no revenue, and 1 unstable server overheating in a borrowed office. I didn't support the technology. I created it, maintained it, and kept it alive while Evan learned how to sound like a CEO. Evan Cross prefers decisions that fit on one slide. He likes speed, optics, and giving orders that feel decisive. Details irritate him. Accountability, even more. When deployments failed and integrations broke, he needed a name to attach to the mess. Mine was convenient. He leaned back, arms crossed. We're done. Effective immediately. No warning, no review, no discussion. Just a clean sentence meant to erase years of work. A few people stared at the table. One engineer looked at me, then away. No one interrupted. This wasn't confusion, it was fear. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, sharp and humiliating. Being blamed was one thing, being blamed publicly, inaccurately, and without the courtesy of facts was something else entirely. Still, I stayed still. I didn't defend myself. I didn't correct him when he listed problems he barely understood. HR slid the paperwork across the table. Evan didn't look at it. He was already checking his phone. I signed. My hand didn't shake. I gathered the folder, stood, and thanked no one. As I walked out, I carried more than my resignation. Tucked inside my notebook was the one thing Evan never bothered to learn about what actually kept this company running. That moment hits harder than it sounds, so check in with yourself for a second. How are you feeling right now? Really, if your head feels heavy, try stepping into another room and opening a window for 2 minutes. Just let fresh air move through the space while you stand still. Where are you listening from today? If this story feels familiar, stay with me, subscribe quietly, and let's see what happened after I walked out with more than they realized. After the meeting ended, the room emptied faster than I expected. I stayed seated, staring at the table where my work had just been reduced to a convenient scapegoat. That silence pressed on memories Evan never bothered to learn. I built this system piece by piece. Long before press releases and investor decks, I designed the architecture, chose the vendors, and wrote the security rules that kept us compliant. When our first server overheated at 2 a.m, I drove across town and rebuilt it myself. When an early client nearly walked after a data scare, I locked everything down and took responsibility. None of that ever made it into Evan's stories. He arrived later, when the product finally worked and success felt inevitable. He loved momentum but avoided foundations, praised vision while ignoring the people who built it. The imbalance grew quietly, then sharply, every time something failed at scale. Evan pointed at engineering without asking why. One outage, caused by a third-party update he approved to save money, became my problem overnight. I fixed it, documented it, and warned him it would happen again. It did. The second failure hit during a growth push. He rushed for headlines. This time, he didn't want solutions. He wanted distance. By the time we reached that meeting, I could feel the narrative turning against me. What stung most wasn't being blamed. It was watching him pretend ignorance of decisions he had personally signed off on. I had absorbed risk, legal exposure, and late nights so he could stay clean. That afternoon, sitting alone after my firing, something finally clicked. I opened my notebook and reread the infrastructure documents I carried everywhere. There it was, quiet and devastating. Evan had never signed the latest renewal on the core systems agreement. He assumed it was handled, the way he assumed everything was. the responsibility, legally and operationally, still sat with me. I closed the notebook slowly, feeling the weight of that realization settle in. Being fired hurt. Being erased hurt more. But knowing the truth changed something inside me. This wasn't over. I hadn't planned revenge. But I understood leverage, and leverage, unlike anger, waits patiently. As I stood up to leave the building, the unfairness no longer felt chaotic. It felt structured. And structure was something I knew how to control. Evan believed he had cut me loose. What he actually did was leave the door unlocked. I walked out carrying my dignity, my documentation, and an unanswered question that would soon be his problem. The pressure in my chest didn't fade, but it sharpened into focus. Every overlooked signature, every ignored warning, lined up in my mind. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready. And the company that had just humiliated me was standing on paperwork it didn't realize was missing. That imbalance, once seen, couldn't be unseen. It followed me out, steady and undeniable. By the time I reached the street, my shock had settled into resolve. What came next wouldn't be loud. It would be precise. Evan thought the story ended with my signature. He was wrong. It was only the point where the truth began to matter. And soon. Everyone would see what he had chosen to ignore, including the man who fired me, in full view. The first email arrived less than an hour after I left the building. Subject line, quick fix needed. No greeting, no context. Just a short paragraph explaining that the system was acting strange and that the team needed me to take a fast look before tomorrow. I didn't reply. That decision wasn't emotional. It was procedural. I read the message once, then archived it. Evan had made his position clear in front of everyone. I was no longer welcome. Responding would only blur a line he had drawn himself. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the binder I hadn't unpacked in years. Contracts age quietly. People forget them because they assume permanence. I never did. I reread every clause, every appendix, every renewal condition that had kept the company functional without anyone noticing. The authority was still there, clean, explicit, undeniable. Evan had signed many things enthusiastically: roadmaps, press releases, hiring plans. What he hadn't signed were the renewals that mattered. The systems agreement wasn't employment-based, it was service-based. Terminating me ended nothing automatically. It simply paused cooperation. That distinction mattered. The next morning, another email came in. This one shorter, slightly sharper. He mentioned the upcoming demo, hinted at investor pressure, asked again if I could just stabilize things. I let it sit. By noon, I made my first move. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't destructive. It was the kind of adjustment people rarely notice until it's gone. I logged into the management console and changed one setting: priority routing. The system would still function, still pass data, still look alive, but it would no longer receive preferential treatment during peak usage. Everything remained compliant. Everything remained documented. I didn't disable anything. I restored defaults. That afternoon, I went about my day. Grocery shopping, a walk. Normal things. The absence of urgency felt unfamiliar but grounding. Late that night, my phone buzzed. A message from one of the engineers. Not Evan. Casual, curious. He asked if I was aware of minor lag they were seeing internally. I replied politely. I said I was no longer involved. I suggested they check their configurations. The next morning, Evan called. I didn't answer. He emailed. I didn't respond. He escalated to a group message, looping in HR and operations, framing the issue as time-sensitive. Still nothing from me. What he didn't understand was that nothing was broken. The system was behaving exactly as designed without extra protection. By midday, usage spiked. The slowdown became visible, not catastrophic, just inconvenient. Video feeds buffered. Dashboards refreshed a beat slower than usual. Enough to irritate, not enough to explain. And then came the timing. That afternoon was the demo. Months of anticipation. External stakeholders. Evan in his element. Confident, prepared, certain. The system didn't fail. It hesitated. Graphs loaded late. Transitions stuttered. One data visualization took longer than expected to populate. Evan joked once, then twice. The room laughed politely. The delay lingered. I wasn't there. But I didn't need to be. I knew how optics worked. A platform that hesitates under scrutiny doesn't inspire confidence. An hour later, my inbox filled. Short messages, urgent ones. Evan again. Operations. Someone from legal asking whether I was still authorized to adjust settings. I read them carefully. Then I opened the contract once more. Section by section. Nothing I'd done violated a term. Nothing obligated me to intervene. I drafted a response, then deleted it that night. I slept well the next day. Evan's tone changed. Apologies appeared without the word sorry. He suggested a call. He mentioned misunderstandings. He implied we could reset. I didn't respond. Instead, I made a note. One line, time-stamped, observational. The system slowdown had occurred exactly when load peaked, exactly when exposure mattered most. That wasn't revenge. It was consequence. Evan believed speed came from pressure. I knew it came from structure. He had dismissed the person who maintained it. Now he was experiencing what remained. Quietly, publicly, precisely. And this was only the first layer. I didn't hear about the fallout directly. I watched it unfold through forwarded messages, calendar cancellations, and the subtle shift in tone from people who suddenly needed answers. Evan reacted the way he always did when control slipped by getting louder. He blamed engineering first, then operations. Meetings stacked on top of meetings. Voices rose. Deadlines were restated as threats. He brought in an outside consulting firm within 24 hours, announcing it as a fresh set of eyes, which was his favorite way of admitting he didn't understand the problem. They started poking at the system aggressively. Configuration changes were made without context. Shortcuts were applied to compensate for load instead of addressing structure. Each attempt to force speed exposed something deeper and uglier. The flaws they uncovered weren't in my architecture. They were in the compromises Evan had approved later. Quietly, to save money and time, I recognized every crack the moment it appeared. I knew which decisions caused them. And when. I stayed silent, from my side. Nothing moved. I didn't reverse my earlier change. I didn't warn them. I simply observed. There was a restrained satisfaction in watching reality assert itself without my involvement. Not joy, not revenge, just confirmation. The consultants escalated their findings. Emails grew longer. Attachments multiplied. Somewhere between the third emergency call and the fifth revised timeline. Panic replaced blame. Evan stopped copying me. Then he started again. Cautiously. His language softened. He asked whether I had thoughts or might have insight. He still didn't apologize. He still assumed access. I declined every invitation by not responding. As pressure mounted, the fixes multiplied. Bandwidth was rerouted. Cache layers were added. Temporary scripts ran overnight. Each intervention helped briefly, then created another instability. It was like watching someone try to silence an alarm by hitting it harder. That was when the questions started coming from outside the company. One investor requested a technical summary before the next update call. Another asked why performance benchmarks had shifted so dramatically after months of stability. A third wanted to know who had signed off on the emergency changes. Evan scrambled. He reassured. He promised clarity. He offered explanations that sounded confident but thin. The consultants asked for documentation he couldn't produce. I read the forwarded threads carefully. I noticed my name appearing less as a culprit and more as a reference point. Before Willa left, under the previous system, compared to the original design, the tension sharpened. Someone finally asked the obvious question during a prep call. Evan didn't know I could still see. Why was the person who built this let go during a critical phase? There was no clean answer to that. Evan deflected again. But the tone had changed. This wasn't internal blame anymore. It was external doubt, the kind that doesn't go away with volume. I closed my laptop and sat still, letting the quiet settle. I hadn't touched a thing since that first adjustment. The system was behaving exactly as allowed. The satisfaction wasn't in watching Evan struggle. It was in realizing the truth no longer needed my voice. The structure was speaking for itself. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, a single question began circulating soft at first, then persistent. If the problem started after I left, why had I been blamed at all? The alarms didn't start with sirens. They began as polite notifications, the kind executives ignore until numbers move. I felt the shift before anyone called me. Because escalation has a rhythm. Once the first layer fails, the second never falls quietly. I logged in and adjusted 2 controls that had remained untouched out of courtesy, not obligation. The first was security oversight. I revoked centralized monitoring privileges that had been granted under my supervision, reverting access to the basic compliance tier. Cameras still recorded, logs still existed, but real-time visibility was gone. No more instant alerts, no more quiet corrections before problems became visible. The second change involved bandwidth priority. I removed the preferential routing that kept their traffic smooth during congestion. The network didn't disappear. It simply stopped favoring them. Data now waited its turn. Both changes were lawful, both were documented, both were reversible with a signed agreement. Within days, the consequences surfaced. A client in Europe complained about dropped connections during peak hours. A domestic partner delayed a rollout after noticing inconsistent response times. Support tickets piled up. Not dramatic, just persistent enough to erode confidence. Evan reacted publicly. He called an all-hands meeting and framed the situation with practiced certainty. He spoke about legacy issues. He referenced decisions made before his leadership had matured. He named me without naming me, then named me outright. The former IT head, he said, had left behind structural weaknesses. He was correcting them. Hearing that didn't hurt the way the firing had. It sharpened something colder. Clients didn't care about blame. They cared about reliability. 2 accounts paused payments. One asked for an audit. Another quietly began testing alternatives. The company's tone shifted from urgency to alarm. I stayed out of it. I watched reports arrive through channels that hadn't realized I still had access. Metrics told the story Evan wouldn't. Usage dipped. Latency spiked during demos. A scheduled launch slipped by 48 hours. Then the losses became visible. One long-term client terminated early, citing performance uncertainty. Another demanded penalty clauses. The press didn't notice yet, but investors did. Evan doubled down. He gave interviews that sounded confident and vague. He blamed transitional gaps. He blamed inherited systems. He blamed me again, louder this time. That was when the invitation arrived. It came from an address I recognized immediately. A competitor, not a small one. A firm Evan liked to dismiss as slow and conservative. They requested a conversation, framed as exploratory, polite, discreet. I read the message twice before responding. We met off-site, quietly, no theatrics, no accusations. They asked precise questions about architecture, scalability, and governance. They didn't ask why I left. They asked what I would build next. I answered honestly. They listened carefully. When the meeting ended, nothing was promised. But as I walked away, I understood the shape of what was coming. Evan was fighting symptoms. Others were studying causes. The alarms were no longer subtle. They were structural. And this time, I wasn't the one being blamed. I was being sought out, on my way home. My phone buzzed again, not with panic, but with curiosity. Another message followed, then another, different senders, similar tone. They had noticed the same thing. Stability didn't vanish randomly. It migrates. I thought about Evan pacing conference rooms, pointing at screens, demanding fixes from people who had never seen the foundation. I thought about customers watching dashboards stall and quietly updating spreadsheets. No shouting, just decisions. That night, I reviewed the competitors' materials they had shared after our meeting. Clean, conservative, built for endurance, not applause. The contrast was striking. By morning, Evan's company issued an internal memo urging calm. By afternoon, two more clients requested contingency plans. Alarm had spread beyond engineering. Finance felt it. Legal felt it. I closed my laptop and allowed myself a moment of clarity. The second layer had fallen, exactly as expected, and the third was already under pressure. This wasn't chaos. It was sequence, and sequence always favors the prepared. I had not raised my voice, touched a server, or made a threat. Yet everything was moving, exactly where it needed to go, without me intervening, directly. I didn't rush the decision. Power looks reckless when it moves too fast, and I wanted this to feel inevitable, not emotional. The competitor followed up 2 days after our first meeting with a draft term sheet and a simple question. How quickly could I deliver stability? I told them the truth. Faster than they expected. We met again, this time with lawyers. Their startup was smaller, disciplined, and painfully aware of what failure cost. They didn't ask for miracles. They asked for guarantees. I gave them something better: structure. The agreement was clean, specific, and respectful of authority, my authority. When I signed, it wasn't symbolic, it was operational. That same afternoon, I initiated the migration. No dramatic switch, no blackout, just a rerouting of priorities and permissions that redirected capacity where it now belonged. The systems didn't resist, they responded. Infrastructure prefers clarity. By evening, the competitor's dashboard stabilized, latency flattened, security alerts synchronized. Their team sent a brief message thanking me for the smooth transition. No celebration, just relief. Evan noticed the impact the next morning. His metrics dipped again, sharper this time. What he didn't understand was why the loss felt so immediate. He assumed clients were leaving. Some were. But the deeper change was structural. The backbone he relied on was no longer aligned to his company's needs. What made it almost elegant was geography. Both companies occupied the same building. Evan's startup still sat on the upper floors. Glass walls and open desks buzzing with urgency. The competitor worked 3 floors below. Quieter, methodical, unremarkable at a glance. The infrastructure that powered them ran through the same vertical spine. I had designed it that way years earlier for efficiency. Now it served precision. Traffic flowed past Evan's floor without stopping. Like a highway exit, no longer marked. His systems functioned, but without preference, without reinforcement. Meanwhile, the competitor's environment thrived on the same physical lines. Tuned for endurance, I watched the logs with professional detachment. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden. The contracts supported every change. The irony wasn't personal. It was architectural. Evan escalated. He sent messages framed as collaboration, then as concern, then as urgency. He asked whether I was aware of external interference. I archived them all. At the end of the week, an internal memo leaked. Evan blamed market conditions. He blamed legacy constraints. He blamed former leadership decisions again. This time more carefully, as if names themselves carried risk. The investors noticed the shift immediately. One requested a side-by-side performance comparison. Another asked why a rival product suddenly outperformed theirs using similar tooling. Evan had answers. None were convincing. Meanwhile, I finalized the last clause of my new agreement. 5 years, clear termination terms, clear authority, clear consequences. The competitor moved their demo schedule up by a week. It ran flawlessly. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Walking through the lobby later that day, I passed Evan near the elevators. He looked tired, distracted, already defensive. He didn't see me at first. When he did, he hesitated, as if unsure which version of me he was allowed to address. I nodded politely and kept walking. The building hummed around us, indifferent and obedient. The same infrastructure, the The same cables, the same systems he once dismissed as background noise, were now defining outcomes. Power hadn't shifted loudly, it had revealed itself quietly, exactly where it had always lived. I understood then that visibility was optional, but control was not. Evan had chased influence through titles and volume. I had held it through systems and signatures. Standing there, I felt no triumph, only certainty. The deal he never saw wasn't hidden. It was ignored. And once ignored, it chose a different owner. That realization settled in quietly, steady and irreversible. As the building continued working flawlessly, indifferent to ego, loyal only to what was properly designed and maintained by me, the weekend arrived without warning, the way collapses often do. By Friday evening, the pressure Evan had tried to contain all week finally broke containment. I could see it in the system metrics before anyone admitted it out loud. Load spiked, queues backed up, and error rates crept past thresholds that once would have triggered immediate intervention. The servers weren't failing. They were suffocating, without prioritized routing and without my oversight. Every process competed blindly. Deployments stalled halfway through execution. Rollbacks failed because authentication tokens expired mid-cycle. Engineers tried to push fixes, only to watch them hang. Then time out. What had once been a controlled environment turned into a bottlenecked maze. Slack messages leaked out through people who hadn't removed me from old channels. Someone typed that the build had been running for 40 minutes. Another replied that production was frozen. A third said they were going home because nothing they touched worked anymore. By Saturday morning, the exhaustion became visible. Half the team logged in remotely, then logged right back out. They weren't lazy. They were blocked. Without stable deployment pipelines, there was nothing meaningful to do except wait. A few senior engineers quietly updated their resumes. Clients noticed before leadership did. Support tickets multiplied. Response times slipped past contractual limits. One customer invoked a performance clause and demanded a call with executive leadership. Evan postponed it twice. That afternoon, my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. Evan never called when he felt in control. I watched it ring until it stopped, then archived the voicemail without listening. A minute later, an email arrived marked urgent. He asked for 30 minutes, then 15, then any availability today. I didn't reply. Sunday made everything worse. Overnight processes failed silently. Scheduled jobs didn't complete. Security scans that required stable throughput never finished their cycles. Logs piled up faster than anyone could read them. Evan called again. This time he left a message. His voice was tight, stripped of confidence. He said there were misunderstandings. He said they needed to talk. He said the company couldn't function like this. I closed the message and set my phone down. Around noon, a system notification caught my attention. Not an alarm, a reminder. One I had configured years ago and almost forgotten about. The automated security certificate governing internal authentication was approaching expiration. It didn't fail suddenly. It warned first. 72 hours remaining. Normally, renewal was invisible. I handled it, validated it, extended it. This time, no one had the authority to do so. The system required my signature. I checked the contract again. Even though I already knew the answer, there was no obligation on my part. The renewal fell under the same agreement Evan had never finalized. By late Sunday afternoon, the mood inside the startup shifted from urgency to helplessness. Messages grew shorter. Anger gave way to silence. Someone suggested powering systems down to prevent damage. Someone else pointed out they couldn't restart them cleanly. I took a walk, letting the clarity settle. This wasn't revenge. It was entropy meeting neglect. As evening fell, Evan sent one last message, not to the group, to me. He asked if we could reset things Monday morning. He promised to listen. I didn't respond. At midnight, the countdown ticked lower. The system still ran. Barely. But its protections were thinning. Authentication delays increased. Access errors began appearing at random. The meltdown wasn't loud, it was exhausting. People logged off not knowing if they would log back in. Evan stared at dashboards that no longer reassured him. By the time the weekend ended, nothing was officially broken, but nothing was truly working either. The company existed in a fragile state, held together by processes about to expire. And somewhere beneath the noise, a clock kept counting down, indifferent to apologies, waiting to decide who was still authorized to remain inside. I watched the numbers stabilize into something brittle, knowing Monday would force decisions no one had prepared for. Decisions that could no longer be postponed or blamed on anyone else publicly. I arrived early on Monday, not because I needed to, but because clarity comes easier before chaos announces itself. The lobby was already louder than usual. Voices overlapped. Badges were swiped again and again, each attempt answered by the same dull refusal. Employees clustered near the turnstiles, holding laptops, phones, coffee cups they hadn't tasted. Screens showed login errors they had never seen before. Credentials invalid. Session expired. Access denied. The system wasn't crashing, it was enforcing rules. I stood off to the side and watched patterns form. Confusion turned to irritation. Irritation turned to fear. Managers tried to calm teams without understanding the problem themselves. Someone called IT. Someone else remembered there was no IT anymore. Upstairs. The office dissolved into noise. Meetings were abandoned mid-sentence. Whiteboards filled with guesses. No one could deploy, authenticate, or even open internal tools. The building felt smaller when productivity vanished. Evan arrived late, moving fast, speaking louder than necessary. He pushed through the crowd toward the security desk, demanding explanations, insisting this was a facilities issue. He swiped his badge repeatedly, harder each time, as if force might persuade the reader. The guard didn't argue. He checked his screen and shook his head. Access inactive. Evan tried again. Then again. When he raised his voice, the guard raised a hand and asked him to step back. Policy was policy. Watching him stopped cold by a process he once ignored felt strangely neutral. Not satisfying, not cruel, just inevitable, inside. The startup's people waited. Some paced. Others sat on the floor scrolling job listings. One engineer laughed quietly, the sound brittle and tired. No one knew whether they were working, unemployed, or something in between. I walked past them and into a small conference room I was still authorized to use. I connected my laptop and reviewed the logs. The security certificate had expired at midnight. As designed, the system invalidated all sessions until renewal. No overrides existed without my credentials. My phone buzzed. Legal. They had finally caught up. The message was brief, direct, and careful. They asked whether I had initiated the lockout. I replied with documentation, timestamps, contract clauses, automated triggers, nothing emotional, nothing accusatory. An hour later, the response came. They acknowledged receipt. They confirmed my interpretation. They stated clearly that I was under no obligation to intervene. The company had failed to maintain its agreement. The outcome, while disruptive, was compliant. I closed the thread and sat still, outside the room. Evan argued with anyone who would listen. He accused vendors. He accused me. He accused the building. His words carried no weight now, without access. Authority sounded hollow. Security escorted him away from the entrance when he tried to push through again. Not aggressively, just firmly. Other tenants watched. No one filmed. The humiliation was quiet. By midday, leadership called an emergency meeting in the lobby. It achieved nothing, without systems. Discussion stalled. Decisions couldn't be documented. Votes couldn't be recorded. People began leaving, some for lunch, some permanently. I packed my things slowly. There was no rush. Justice doesn't hurry. As I stepped outside, the building resumed its normal rhythm. Elevators moved, lights adjusted. Other companies worked uninterrupted. Only one floor remained silent. I checked my phone one last time. Legal had sent a final note. They reiterated their position: no breach, no liability, no action required from me. That was it. Cold, procedural, and complete. I walked away knowing the system had done exactly what it was meant to do. Without anger, without mercy, without my hands touching it at all. The fairness of it settled slowly, like temperature returning to normal after a storm. Nothing about the lockout was personal anymore. It belonged to process, to signatures missing where signatures mattered. Evan had treated systems as background noise, assuming they would always bend. Instead, they held their shape. They didn't punish him. They simply refused to recognize authority he no longer possessed, leaving consequences to unfold in plain view. That silence marked the exact moment control changed hands, permanently and without appeal. The meeting was scheduled for 9 sharp, which told me everything I needed to know. When people are confident, they leave room for delay. When they are afraid, they demand precision. I arrived early, not to prepare, but to observe who arrived first and who avoided eye contact. Evan came in last. He looked smaller without an audience. His confidence folded inward, his voice already measured. The investor representatives were seated, papers aligned, expressions neutral in the practiced way of people who expect explanations, not excuses. The attorney sat between us, laptop open, fingers still. I took my seat without greeting anyone. Silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable, until Evan cleared his throat. He started with history, how far the company had come, how valuable collaboration had been in the early days. He said my name carefully, as if it might fracture if spoken too firmly. When that didn't land, he shifted tone and asked whether we could find a way forward together. I listened without reacting. The tension in the room tightened, drawn by the contrast between what he was saying and what had already happened. One investor asked directly whether the system's issues could be reversed. Evan looked at me before answering, then admitted they required my involvement. Another asked why the renewal agreement had not been executed. Evan hesitated. The attorney finally spoke, stating that the document was unsigned and therefore inactive. That was the opening, I explained calmly, without embellishment, that the previous agreement had expired, that no interim authorization existed, that the services Evan assumed were permanent were, in fact, conditional. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Evan interrupted, his voice sharper now. He said the termination had been a misunderstanding. He said emotions had run high. He said he was willing to restore our partnership immediately. I met his eyes for the first time. I told him partnerships require mutual recognition. I reminded the room that I had been dismissed publicly, without cause, and without regard for the responsibilities I held. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I let facts speak. The attorney asked whether reinstating the original contract would resolve the situation. I shook my head. That contract no longer existed. Silence again. Thicker this time. One investor leaned forward and asked what options remained. I explained there were new agreements in place, signed and operational. Capacity had been allocated elsewhere. Authority had shifted accordingly. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden. Evan's face changed then. Not anger, calculation. He asked whether terms could be renegotiated. He said the company would pay any premium. He said they needed stability. I told him stability begins before crisis, not during it. The attorney confirmed my position. The prior contract had lapsed. No automatic renewal applied. Any new arrangement would require fresh negotiation. Subject to availability. Availability, he added, was limited. The room absorbed that quietly. One investor asked the final question. The one Evan had been avoiding since the weekend. Who, they asked, currently controlled the infrastructure? I answered simply, I do. No one argued. No one challenged it. The meeting shifted at that moment. Subtle but unmistakable. Questions were no longer directed at Evan. They came to me. Evan tried once more. He said the company needed unity. He said this outcome served no one. His words sounded reasonable, but they arrived too late. I stood, signaling the end. I told them decisions had consequences, and some consequences could not be reversed on demand. I said I would honor existing commitments, nothing more. As I left the room, I felt the tension release behind me, snapping not with noise, but with finality. Power doesn't announce itself when it changes hands, it simply stops answering to the old voice. By the time the door closed, the shift was complete, sealed not by anger, but by signatures that had never been written, and therefore could no longer be rewritten. I didn't plan to speak first, but the room seemed to lean toward me. Waiting. After the failed meeting, the board requested a closed session. Same faces, tighter jaws. This time, Evan couldn't hide behind optimism or urgency. The numbers were printed, highlighted, and laid out like evidence. I began with the facts, not opinions, not feelings. I explained how the original system was designed, what assumptions it relied on, and which changes had destabilized it. I showed timelines, dates, approvals. Every shortcut had a signature. None of them were mine. Evan tried to interrupt. The chair stopped him. I continued, describing the outage everyone blamed on legacy flaws. I showed the email where Evan approved the cost-cutting patch against my recommendation. I showed the risk memo he never circulated. I showed the follow-up he asked me to bury, so investors wouldn't panic. The room shifted. People stopped taking notes and started listening. Next, I addressed security. I explained how oversight was reduced months before I left, not after. How warnings were dismissed as over-engineering. How audit deadlines were deferred to preserve optics. Evan stared at the table. I didn't accuse him of incompetence. I let his decisions speak. I explained how responsibility works in systems like ours. How authority without accountability creates fragility. How problems don't disappear when ignored. They compound. One investor asked why these details were surfacing now. I answered simply, because I was no longer protecting anyone. That landed harder than anything else. Evan finally spoke, louder than he meant to. He said I was rewriting history. He said I was bitter. He said none of this justified what was happening now. I looked at him calmly and said, this is what's happening now. The attorney confirmed my documentation. The external auditor confirmed the gaps. One by one, the explanations Evan relied on collapsed under scrutiny. The narrative flipped, not dramatically, methodically. Then came the question that changed everything. A board member asked whether Evan had knowingly misrepresented system readiness during the last funding update. Silence. Evan denied it. The email contradicted him. The chair called for a recess. No one moved. Instead, the investors exchanged looks. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was trust. I felt something release inside me. Not anger, but relief. The truth didn't need defense. It just needed space. The chair proposed a vote. Immediate. No delay. No hallway conversations. The motion was read aloud. Confidence in leadership had been compromised. Governance required action. Evan looked around, searching for allies. He found none. The votes were cast in the room, quietly, deliberately, one by one. When it ended, the outcome was clear. Evan was removed effective immediately, pending formal transition, access revoked, authority reassigned. He stood slowly, disbelief written across his face. He didn't look at me as he left. No one celebrated. They didn't need to. The satisfaction was contained, professional, undeniable. As the meeting adjourned, several investors thanked me, not for exposing him, but for building something solid in the first place. One said the company might survive now. I gathered my notes and stood. The explosion everyone expected never came. What filled the space instead was order returning. Evan had fired the wrong person. Believing control lived in titles and volume. He was wrong. It lived in understanding, in memory, in records that don't forget. Walking out. I felt the weight lift completely. Justice hadn't arrived with drama. It arrived with signatures, votes, and a room finally willing to listen. That was enough. I paused outside the room, aware that nothing about this moment would trend or be quoted. It didn't need to. The company had chosen clarity over charisma, process over personality. That choice would ripple quietly through hiring, through roadmaps, through every decision that followed. I knew then that whatever came next for me would be built on respect, not fear, and that, finally, felt like a win that didn't require witnesses. I walked away steady, certain that endings like this are rare, precise, and earned, not given. They closed doors while opening foundations underneath everything. The eviction didn't begin with an announcement. It began with silence. After the vote, Evan disappeared from the building, as if the structure itself had rejected him. His access was revoked, his title removed from internal systems, his authority erased in the same way it had once been assumed permanent. No farewell email followed, no dramatic exit, just absence. I watched it all from a distance. The board appointed interim leadership within hours. Lawyers moved faster than emotions ever could. Notices were issued, leases reviewed, obligations recalculated. The company had lost more than a CEO. It had lost the right to remain where it was. By midweek, the decision was final. The startup would vacate the building. There was no press release about it, no public framing of strategy. Internally, it was called restructuring. Externally, it looked like retreat. Employees packed quietly, some relieved, some bitter. Many simply tired. The office that once buzzed with urgency now echoed with cardboard boxes and unfinished conversations. I didn't go up there. People asked why I wasn't present, why I didn't take a victory lap, why I didn't speak publicly after everything that had happened. The truth was simple. Justice didn't require my visibility anymore. My role had ended the moment the system corrected itself. Evan tried once, through counsel, to delay the move. He argued continuity, sunk costs, brand perception, none of it mattered. The infrastructure agreements had already been reassigned. The building no longer supported his company's needs. Staying would only bleed resources faster. So they left. The last day came and went without ceremony. Security supervised the exit. Assets were logged. Keys were returned. By evening, the floor was dark, not closed, just empty. I walked past the building that night without stopping. I didn't look up. 2 weeks later, the space reopened. The new startup moved in methodically, without spectacle. Same address, same elevators, same core infrastructure, different discipline. They didn't announce their arrival. They simply began working. Their growth was quiet but unmistakable. Systems stabilized. Clients noticed. Talent followed. Within months, the metrics Evan once chased appeared naturally, without strain. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. From the outside, it looked like continuity. From the inside, it was replacement. The foundation remained. The behavior changed. I stayed out of the spotlight. My name didn't appear in articles. I declined interviews. I attended meetings only when necessary and spoke only about systems, not people. That distance preserved something important. The outcome felt earned, not engineered. Occasionally, someone would ask what happened to Evan. The answer varied depending on who asked. He moved on. He consulted. He tried again. None of it concerned me. What mattered was that the building worked, that the systems were respected, that decisions aligned with reality instead of ego. The final confirmation came months later, when an investor mentioned, almost casually, that the new company had surpassed the old one's peak valuation. Same location, same market, different leadership. I nodded and changed the subject. Completion doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with equilibrium restored. The chaos recedes, the noise fades. What remains is function. I never needed to evict Evan personally. The process did that for me. It removed him from the role he could no longer justify and made room for something better. Justice, I learned, isn't loud. It's precise. It closes loops. It leaves nothing dangling. Walking away from the building one evening, I felt no triumph, only calm. The space Evan once occupied now held progress. The system had corrected itself fully. That was the end of it. I didn't feel victorious when it was over. I felt quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after a system finally stabilizes and stops throwing errors no one wants to admit existed. Winning had never been the point. Order was. Looking back, I can see how easy it would have been to confuse what I did with revenge. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't embarrass anyone publicly. I didn't celebrate Evan's fall. I simply stopped protecting a structure that no longer respected the work holding it up. Power, I learned, doesn't look like satisfaction. It looks like restraint. It looks like knowing when not to interfere, when to let consequences follow decisions without adding emotion to the process. You don't punish ego. You remove its foundation. There's a difference. Evan believed authority came from being seen, from occupying space loudly and forcing momentum through will. I understood something else. Real authority lives in preparation, in contracts read carefully, in systems designed to endure stress instead of denying it. When the company failed, it wasn't because I acted. It failed because critical responsibilities were ignored long before I stepped away. My absence only revealed the truth faster. I don't replay the meetings in my head anymore. I don't imagine different outcomes or sharper words. There's no need. Justice didn't require performance. It required alignment. What followed felt distinctly American in the way only corporate reality can be. No villains in handcuffs, no dramatic speeches, just governance asserting itself, agreements enforcing boundaries, and leadership being evaluated by results instead of charisma. The company that replaced Evans grew steadily, not explosively. It respected process. It listened to engineers. It asked questions before promising answers. Watching that from the outside confirmed everything I already knew. I didn't win because Evan lost. I won because the system corrected itself. That's what real power looks like. Not dominance, not humiliation, stability, continuity, the ability to walk away without needing credit. I learned something else in the aftermath, something quieter than strategy. Walking away didn't mean disappearing. It meant choosing where my effort mattered. I kept advising, building, reviewing systems for people who valued diligence over drama. Work felt lighter without fear attached. Decisions were slower, but stronger. Trust replaced urgency. That shift was the real reward. Not money, not recognition, but freedom from chaos disguised as ambition. I slept better, I spoke less, I listened more. When problems surfaced, they were addressed, not hidden. When mistakes happened, they were owned. That environment reminded me why I built systems in the first place, not to control people, but to protect them from preventable failure and unnecessary noise. It also reminded me that quiet competence outlasts spectacle, and that lasting success rarely comes from winning fights, but from removing the conditions that create them in the first place for everyone involved. Long-term stability. Somewhere along the way, the noise stopped mattering. What remained was balance. And balance, once restored, doesn't announce itself. It simply works. I didn't survive that moment by being louder, smarter, or more ruthless. I survived it by staying grounded in what I knew to be true. Even when the room tried to rewrite it for me. That's the part people rarely talk about, the quiet cost of being blamed for something you built with care. And the strength it takes not to let bitterness decide your next move. What stayed with me most was the human side of it, the exhaustion, the self-doubt, the urge to explain myself to people who weren't listening. I learned that fairness doesn't always arrive when you ask for it, but it does respond when you stop abandoning yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back, let the noise pass, And trust that solid work has its own memory. If you've ever been pushed aside, talked over, or made to feel invisible, I hope this story felt a little like company. Are you staying with me until the very end? There's more ahead, and it matters. After listening, do one small thing for yourself tonight. Give your eyes a real break. Turn off the screen for 10 minutes, dim the lights, and let your vision rest. It sounds simple, but your body keeps score. By the way, where are you listening from right now if this story resonated? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share it with someone who might need it. Tap like if it spoke to you, and consider subscribing. These stories keep going because of people like you, and we're just getting started.